In this lecture, we're going to talk about the love of nature and environmental ethics. It's chapter 7 of the book Biophilia, Love of Life. The love of green seems to be a common thread linking all of humanity as well as most animals. When we see dry plains and land and green fields, why do we prefer green? Is it so we can feed ourselves or our animals? Is it because they provide shade from the heat? We enjoy the shade of trees. Is green also suggest there is a source of life-giving water which we need? It may be an oasis. Do we cry for the earth because our genes will disappear or because of a love of nature? In the pictures, let's look at different aspects of the wonder of nature. This is a picture of vultures feeding on a carcass. This is a picture of trees, but if you look carefully, you can see the trees are actually around a cemetery. Why do we prefer a cemetery to be in nature? It's almost like we want to go back to nature when we die. We can find this tradition in many old stories, such as going to the top of mountains when we would like to die. Or the cherry blossoms. The cherry blossoms may be appreciated because of their transience, or their beauty, or their fragrance. A blue sky fills our soul with delight, but grey is usually depressing. Though long-awaited rain can also be a blessing. While blue is an ideal, if we're in a drought, a sign of a great cloud can bring joy. Prayers for rain are actually seen universally in times of drought, whether it be in Australia, New Zealand, India or Egypt. We can also see prayers for rain expressed perhaps by chimpanzees as well in Africa. On the other hand, floods caused by excess rain afflict many countries of the world, and the incidence of disasters has doubled over the past 2 decades. This is the other side of rain. The blue sea is yet another ideal. Is it because we came from the sea, as some people have hypothesized, or because our food comes from the sea? The blue ocean is clean and pure, like the Pacific. I live in Japan and New Zealand, and now in California. These are different Pacific islands, and I often see the coast or fly over the ocean. The love of blue is soothing, and the ocean is where I have asked my ashes to be returned to. This again comes from a peacefulness of the ocean. Color may also be important for our sense of cleanliness, and perhaps this was evolved as a safety method to avoid drinking contaminated water. Polluted water from factories is more dramatic when it includes color, such as the wastewater from the dyeing industry or the pulp and paper industry. Oil spills discolor the sea and bring much outcry. Invisible pollutants are better tolerated aesthetically, although they're often more toxic. And we can see in recent years the pollution of radioisotopes in the sea caused by radioactive nucleotide reprocessing or accidents has led to great concern over feeding on fish, or especially fish that feeds on the bottom where these pollutants accumulate. The same is seen in the accumulation of PCBs in the Great Lakes of the United States and in other countries where they were widely used until it was realized that they are toxic for life and they bioconcentrate. So color is one sense that we can see the purity. In the 1930s, Aldo Leopold proposed a land ethic to protect the land from further degradation. He focused on degraded land, although actually 70% of the world is covered by water, and some have suggested that aqua ethics may have been a better term. Leopold in 1949 in Missand Ornament proposed land ethics as a mode of guidance for meeting ecological situations so new or intricate or involving such deferred reactions that the path of social expediency is not discernible to the average individual. Fritz Jahr and Van Riese Potter have also had ecocentric views of bioethical dilemmas, and actually the first paper using the word bioethics, written by Fritz Jahr, is titled The Bioethical Responsibilities of Human Beings to Plants and Animals. Well, despite the nice words and sentiments, from lack of practical concern shown for the environment, it appears that the environment and its protection is not a dominating motivation in most people's life. Environmental education is to teach the facts about the environment. It can teach people that our relationship to other parts of nature is one of love, or dependency, or one of mutual compatibility, or maybe one of belonging, that we belong to nature. Environmental ethics education is more than just environmental education. It is to teach how to incorporate facts and values of different organisms into ethical decision making. Environmental ethics education teaches how long we should live, whereas environmental education is linguistically descriptive, how do we live? However, much of the environmental education is actually also teaching some values. But without teaching how to balance all interests, the facts and values, it can be just propaganda. So we can ask, is there a love of life? Especially if such strong education is needed to help protect the environment, we can really ask, do we really have an inherent love for life and nature? And by nature we include both the natural world, both living and non-living. People do have a greater affinity for living beings than material objects in general, although some mountains and landscape features have been given spiritual qualities and characters at times. Is there a love of life? The idea that there was an ether that made things alive special has been generally dismissed in mainstream science, but still many people feel more empathy for plants than for rocks. The interrelatedness of all living organisms can be readily seen in most ecosystems. All organisms need water. All organisms have the same genetic code and share similar genes. All creatures appear, at first sight at least, to be temporal. They live and they die. This relatedness is expressed by the idea that they are all alive. They share something, life. There is also a continuity between inorganic and organic. Ecology refers to the relationship of every organism with the environment. So is there anything which distinguishes living organisms from non-living organisms, beyond that they use information to replicate, and that information is non-random? Ed Wilson proposed the theory biophilia, saying that human beings inherently have a love for nature. He defined biophilia as the innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes, noting that to the degree that we come to understand other organisms, we will place greater value on them and on ourselves. It's still a matter of debate, I think, about whether biophilia is real or not. Included in the hypothesis is that the human inclination to affiliate with life is inherent. That means it's biologically based. Part of our species' evolutionary heritage, associated with human competitive advantage and genetic fitness, and likely to increase the possibility for achieving individual meaning and personal fulfillment, and that it has a self-interested basis for a human ethic of care and conservation of nature. Although many in modern society seem to destroy nature, it is suggested that this may merely be a result of an unnatural estrangement with nature. One of the aspects of nature which people seem to love is the diversity of living organisms. People put high value on biodiversity. The United Nations World Charter of Nature declared every form of life is unique, warranting respect, regardless of its worth to man. This type of valuation is extrinsic. We need to ask whether there is any intrinsic value to nature and life. We could reconsider the term selfishness as a conservation of intrinsic value, but we're left with the fact that the planet loves life, and so do we. We may not know where the value of life comes from, but every organism loves its own life, and at least tries to reproduce its own kind. Some organisms can picture others as themselves, giving extrinsic value to others, but at least in their actions to love life or try to survive. Well, if there's intrinsic value, then we have even more reason not to harm. As you see in the pictures of the rose, the love of flowers is universal, and many farmers and shops rely on this for their business. The love of flowers also is an expression of beauty used to make urban areas look more natural. The image of a swan swimming in the river is also an image of peaceful harmony. The roses here with the water, isn't that a symbol of love? That we'd like to appreciate that. These are painted fusamas from Japan. They are bringing nature into the room. Actually, the outside of this room is also open to nature. And here we have animals on the cover of a building. This is often seen in temples and spaces in Korea and China, and to some degree in Japan. Well, why do people want to protect nature? Many want to protect nature not because of its value or property, but simply because it's there. As Mary Midgley said, when she wrote about the duty of care and responsibility, and looking at the terms motherland and fatherland, she wrote, "To insist that it is really only a duty to be exploiting human beings is not consistent with the emphasis often given to reverence for the actual trees, mountains, lakes, rivers, and the life which are found there. A decision to inhibit this rich area of human love is a special maneuver for which reasons would need to be given, not a dispassionate analysis of existing values and beings." So we do have an intrinsic love of nature. The widespread respect for nature and life was seen in the results of the International Bioethics Survey and the comments and pictures that have been reproduced in the book Bioethics for the People, by the People, that I wrote in 1994. By more research into the way people look at nature, we can find shared universal ideals about the relationship of nature, humans and nature to each other, humans to the earth, and human responsibility to nature. We can find images of life in statues and brand names, to mention just a few examples of the imagery of life. We should emphasize the value of being alive and the principles of to do no harm and environmental stewardship common to the roots of all people's beliefs. In Japanese, the word inochi can be translated as life, nature, and energy that holds things together. There are various images as shown in comments about it, but the inochi of each living organism is distinct, unique, and equal. The inochi departs when an organism dies and is distinct from the idea of a soul. All organisms share the same amount of life, whether they are dead or alive. A similar idea is expressed in some ancient Greek thinking, and the idea continued in Western thinking with the idea of vitalism. There's a similar idea in Hebrew. This thinking was challenged by the discovery that the chemicals found in living organisms were the same as those found in inorganic matter. It's now possible to synthesize DNA from chemicals and use the information in such DNA to make proteins, such as an active enzyme. We can also make completely synthetic genomes and construct cells based on these genomes, and this has been achieved. So some would say there's no longer anything vitalistic about the workings of the cell, and the genes can be changed around in a predictable way. Well, let's reflect. Let's look at some images of life in stone. This is a Zen garden in Kyoto, Japan. The stones are presented in the garden to allow better Zen meditation. Here we have statues of religious idols, of Lord Buddha and other idols which might be animals and plants in Japan. Here we have a picture of plants that are carved in the walls of the Taj Mahal in India. And here is the image of a lion, found in Paris, in France. Statues of lions are found around the world as symbols of power, as symbols of life, and in fact a very strong life. So, although there might not be something any more vitalistic, we still seem to have a reverence for life and the images that we have. What remains undiscovered is the basis of mechanisms that are gradually being understood. However, we may still believe that life itself is special, even if we do understand, no matter how it comes into being, or how much of a process we understand. We don't rely on a God of the gaps. We don't rely on a God of the gaps, for example. We want to continue to think about the awe and the vitalism of life, no matter where we see it. Even if we understand the reason for the blooming of a flower, we may still value its beauty. The value is distinct from the value given to a being because it has a soul. But there are some similarities, as mentioned above, with regard to autonomy. The idea of a vital energy of life is still found in many people's thinking. Even if they understand the biological reductionism of genetics, they must still believe that there is a special energy or essence associated with being alive. Whether or not we do, we may still want to protect life. On the other hand, we may attempt to destroy diseases because they destroy lives that we value. As I have a doctorate in molecular biology, I understand the genes and the mechanism of life. It still is amazing. It still is something to be valued, and I think that will continue, that value of life. It's maybe critical for us as an organism to value life. There's numerous poems and images from the point of view of plants from around the world. They're used both as allegories for human love, but also by that use in itself suggests a feeling of oneness with other species. So let's look at a prayer, "The fig feels to speak its mind." It's from a papyrus in Egypt, in the New Kingdom. So it's more than 2,000 years old. When the fig feels called to speak its mind, moving leaves begin to whisper. If she ever decided to ask it, I would quietly die for my mistress. Was ever lady so noble as me? If her quick-handed slaves were not there, it is I would play humble servant. I was brought from a wet, hostile land, uprooted as plunder for my beloved. She had them set me here in the orchard. She saved me. But the deer never lets me spend my day drinking, nor fills my insides with sweet ditch water. How in the world can a girl enjoy life with such terrible thirst and not drinking? By my deathless soul, if it survives, sweetheart, fetch me some water. Next time you see a plant that wants to be watered, if it wants is a term but we're not sure, but certainly there is a love of life that would demand creatures to receive water, whether they only be plants or whether they be human beings. A more definite sympathy with the non-human is seen in the Buddhist writings, for example in the hymn to friendliness in Pali literature in Theravada Buddhism. May all be happy and safe, may all beings gain in the joy, all living beings whatsoever without exception, weak or strong, whether seen or unseen, dwelling afar or near, born or yet unborn, may all beings feel joy. The extension of love to other species could be considered under the concept of stewardship. Stewardship can apply to both the way people use other humans and the rest of nature. It has often been neglected, with a long history in many religions being central to a Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation, means stewardship is a term you may be familiar with. Usually people prefer to ignore it and to think of dominion over humans, over the earth, treating the earth with little value. However, we see that many problems that has caused. There are numerous pollution problems that we can readily see, which affect humans and other species around the world. So stewardship is something which we certainly need today. Throughout time, many have considered nature has extrinsic value, but usually these calls have been neglected. Alfred North Whitehead, in Science in the Modern World, said, "The Western world is now suffering from limited moral outlook of 3 previous generations. The 2 evils are, 1, the ignoration of the true relation of each organism to its environment, and the other, the habit of ignoring the intrinsic worth of the environment, which must be allowed its weight in any consideration of final ends." The intrinsic value of nature can be argued by Christian or Buddhist values and is common to many indigenous religions and common across the world. Human beings affect the world, all the world, most directly when they exploit our resources. Human beings are dependent upon this use of resources, and we need to consider agriculture and aquaculture in particular. Nature includes both agricultural land, cities and wider regions, all of nature. We need to have an integrated view and not just consider artificial areas as areas which are artificial. At the same time, plans to green deserts with genetically engineered trees and plants may concern us, though such future forests will be part of nature, as would a potato making bioplastic. So let's look at the next section, images of nature as a whole. The idea of holism suggests we should treat all life as a whole system, not pulling apart the elements or individuals. While reductionism is useful for scientific investigation to understand the mechanism and to break down the problems, nature works as a whole ecosystem together in the biosphere. This is analogous to trying to isolate individual persons from their family and communities as moral agents. Holism has been the norm throughout history, and it's a useful thread to link bioethics, both environmental ethics, medical ethics, or social ethics. We cannot treat items or moral agents just as isolated individuals. Images of nature as a whole. Early human cultures worshipped the mystery of life in various ways. The earliest culted figures from Paleolithic ages are mother figures. Mother Earth was worshipped under many names in America, India, and Europe. Mother Earth is worshipped in some rituals. She may be set against the Father of Heaven. The symbol leads to a more dualistic view of the world. The creation narratives in the Old Testament are polemics against the Canaanite matriarchal cults. The pre-Aryan Indian Jains saw the universe as a colossal human being. The organism of the world mother was populated with living things without number. There are numerous other symbols that have been used for the world, like the feast, or the dance, the theatre, music, as a play. These items unite the things of the world together. In a similar spirit, recently the Gaia hypothesis has been advanced, that the Earth as a whole is alive. Let's look at a couple of trees. Sequoia trees, the world's largest trees, and one of the longest living trees. This is General Grant, the second largest tree in the world. It's in California. And the next one is General Sherman, tree here. It's the largest tree in the world. It's a sequoia, California as well. Interestingly, human beings named these two trees after famous Civil War generals. Maybe trees denote the power of the military. Well, let's look also at nature as an integrated and flexible system. The railroads brought people within reach of far distant lands and nature quickly. They developed into a tourism. We saw in many countries the development of national parks. At the same time, we also saw the destruction of nature as people settled forests and mountains and made farms and tried to move into those areas. Nature is also quite a flexible and integrated system. We can see here two bear cubs playing in nature. Crocodiles. This is from a crocodile farm in Tamil Nadu, in India. Conservation efforts for some species, such as a crocodile, have succeeded to preserve many species, though there may not be natural habitat left for reintroduction to the wilderness, so we're left with crocodile farms for them to live. These kangaroos, they're on a golf course. I don't know if you play golf, but these kangaroos do not play golf, but they like to eat the grass. They can feed on the farms or golf courses and adapt to the modification of former grassland habitats. So these ideas of nature as an energy and something to be valued and special seem to unite the things of the world together. In a similar spirit, we have seen people thinking about the revival of indigenous culture. Is indigenous culture close to the Gaia hypothesis? Maybe, or maybe not. There's different cosmologies of people, and you can see some of these in the work on the report on ethics and biodiversity, which is also dealt with in one of our separate lectures. So in the Judeo-Christian view, nature is created by God. Nature itself is not divine, but is a handiwork of the Lord. Therefore, humanity does not face a world full of capricious and ambiguous gods who are alive in the objects of the natural world. Nature is not terrifying, as it is to some primitive cultures that view every act as God's response to their actions, and often rather hostile acts of God. The biblical view of a relation between natures and humans is that they are both continually dependent on God. Humans have been told to subdue, cultivate, and take care of the earth, to multiply, and have dominion over the created order. In this way, a Christian's vocation is to continue the good work of creativity. The world was made good, but humans chose evil. A very common alternative worldview is that humans are innocent, but trapped in an evil world. We can see this view also in some Asian religions that look on the visible universe as illusionary and sometimes as insignificant or even evil. Matter is seen as relatively bad. Goodness is only attributed to the spirit, and the religion's lack in its religious task is to transcend the world. I don't know if you're religious or not, and how your religion looks at nature, but reflect on this. Dualism is one of the challenges that may have led to an alienation of human beings from nature, but we're not sure. So another metaphor is that the earth is just a machine. This has led to segregation of the divine from the world, including the world of human beings, and ultimately leads to atheism, that the world, machine, and human beings can function without God. It also leads to devaluation of nature and life. There are also scientific arguments supporting holism. Human life affects other organisms and the environment, and it always will. We can see the effects of human activity everywhere in the world, in the atmosphere and throughout the oceans. Okay? From the poles to the tropics, and from the coastal lowlands to the highest mountains, everywhere. The amount of land that we use to live in, and the one part that we use to grow our food on, and the amount of resources that we have is increasing, except for the amount of resources that we have. It's the substances and waste that we produce that may have the greatest effect on land, however. We need to recycle and need to eliminate this externalization of production cycles that lead to destruction of nature. We also, as a species, can produce new substances and release very large amounts or quantities of naturally occurring substances that may disturb local and global cycles. So we need to consider the impact of our environment. The flow of these substances is important. Such cycles do change with time. Nature has a history from a beginning and a change or evolves. Okay. The physical world regularly changes. We have seen ice ages, for example. Some organisms die and others thrive. Nature has changed in dramatic ways in the past. The current number of different species that are alive may be only a few percent of the total species that have existed since the dawn of life. At no time in the past has nature been more dynamic than now. Because humans are rapidly changing it, we're raising the level of carbon dioxide. What is your view? Do you think nature is just a machine? Are you having a scientific view that supports the idea that holism is a theory? Which part of the cycle is your local habitat in, as the environment cycles between different stages? So we are changing our world dramatically. We are depleting the ozone layer and increasing the amount of UV radiation reaching the surface. The Montreal Protocol for the elimination of CFCs, carbofluorocarbons, chlorines, chlorofluorocarbons and others, led to a decrease in this harmful substance that depleted the ozone layer. And actually in a relatively short time frame as paradigm shifts go. But we need still to move on other environmental issues. And we may have treaties to stop pollutants in the environment. In fact, we have internationally more than 300 treaties dealing with parts of the environment. But not all of these are implemented. And we're still making new pollutants. Some of these lead to extinction of species, some do not. We are also increasing our population from 7 billion to 9 billion in several decades. This exponentially increases all the problems. Today we can doubly say that nature is dynamic, but maybe it's too much. And we're one of the causative factors of this dynamism. Biodiversity is a word used to picture the great diversity of living organisms on the planet. It was coined by Ed Wilson, the same Ed Wilson who coined the term biophilia. Just as the individual processes of life are dynamic, so is a composite of the life forms. The idea of dynamism implies also a balance. This is illustrated by the words biosphere, food webs, or ecosystem, with the largest ecosystem being nature itself. The dynamic nature is also implied in both science, the second law of thermodynamics, and religion, and in religious doctrines, both Judeo-Christian and creation and preservation, and other Asian religions with harmony and creation stories. Nature changes with time. Some organisms die and others thrive. So let's look and reflect on biodiversity. In your religion, are there many stories to preserve biodiversity? One of these, for example, is the story of Noah. This is famous in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions. All the domestic wild animals were saved from environmental catastrophe, a catastrophe that was caused by the sins and actions of humans. Modern efforts at conservation may focus on the whole ecosystem, such as protection of a forest or particular species such as crocodiles. Many cultures have a flood story. We're also seeing concerns about the balance of nature, the way different species at different levels of the food web exist together, and it is delicate. Some species eat others and others eat them. Others are dependent on a modification of the environment made by another species. There are competitors at every level. There is an important inbuilt tendency for species to reproduce so quickly that they may be able to increase their numbers dramatically. Yet this does not mean it's good for the planet. If it doesn't occur too dramatically, then we have a more balanced ecosystem. When we have a competition for resources, the struggle for existence, each species tries to survive, to reproduce. But if one takes too much, the whole system may collapse. This concept of balance in the ecosystem is very old. It is seen in Plato's Timaeus, who answers the question, in likeness of what animal did the Creator make the world? And the answer that God did not make the world, okay, that was the answer at that time. And did not make the world like any one species, but rather the world is made as one visible animal comprehending within itself all other animals of a kindred nature. So this idea highlights how life itself is intertwined in a web of complex relationships. There's also a continuity between inorganic and organic. Ecology refers to this relationship of every organism to the environment. So no matter what your worldview is, whether you think God made the world, whether the world was made randomly, or whether the Creator made animals in the world to make great diversity, we can appreciate it. And we do appreciate the balance. In this figure, we look at one of the concerns that many people had, and to some degree we still see. It's about genetically modified organisms. So how do we define a recombinant DNA plant? This is a sign from Japan in 1992. It was actually at the Ministry of Agriculture Isolation Fields in Tsukuba Science City, Japan. And the principle of love of life, do no harm, makes us cautious in the introduction of new varieties to the environment, such as those made by genetic engineering or recombinant DNA. However, if the safety is confirmed, then they're grown outside. This is also, this great concern about genetic engineering was seen in some other places as well. This is a protest in Japanese language, which is quite rare for civil organizations in Japan. And in a sense it was a sign of bioethical maturity, that you see a sign made by the public outside a scientific research laboratory saying we should not have a P4 containment facility in Japan. P4, protection level 4, is the highest level of security of biological hazards, and was used only for, in fact, very pathogenic diseases such as foot and mouth disease or Ebola, for example. So people will object to this. Actually, we also are seeing protests about the destruction of nature, and this is, in fact, perhaps a greater issue. Several hundred species are being killed each year, we may agree. The latest data actually is several hundred species are not being killed each year, but each day. Each day. In the past, the extinction rate, which did occur, was very low. So this extrapolation to a very rapid rate of extinction of species caused by human action makes us question again the love of nature that we have. Although most people are aware of the loss of species in nature, because the abundance of complexity of ecosystems has not been able to be assessed, an accurate rate of the species lost is not really possible. While less than 2 million species have been identified, at least 5 to 30 million remain yet to be identified. And the problem of diversity loss is broader than the extinction of species, because diversity losses can occur at every level of the biological organization. Although the loss of a few individual species may be seen to be unimportant, the disappearance of a few species can dramatically affect the ecosystem from where they disappeared. The current rate of loss of species is greater than the estimated rate of that species evolve. And the same is true in most ecosystems and most continents of the world. Let's move to consider what is the integrity of nature. We need to ask whether there's an ethical value in having different species. While we can argue for human benefit from biodiversity, is there any ethical value in maintaining different species? Does it make any difference if the biodiversity is found in a rainforest or botanic garden, or in a wild hillside or in a golf course? And is a variety of ethical approaches to biodiversity. Does it matter that this figure is actually not organic, but plastic? Could they be part of nature? If you go to Disneyland, are the trees natural, or are some of the trees constructed trees? So we have a mixture, a hybridization. They always keep their leaves. They always look perfect. Are they? In the future, when we design our cities and we have trees which will remove pollution from the air, we may not only use natural trees, but we may create artificial trees as places where we can remove toxic pollutants using things which look like leaves. Of course, leaves do this already. So there's a value assigned to life because of its naturalness or unplanned structure, and we see this in extreme wilderness areas. A related idea then is of species integrity, which says that species should not be mixed, for example, by genetic engineering. Modern biologists generally think of species as reproductive communities or populations. There is no universal absolute rule, but all species are distinctly bounded in any generally consistent manner. One species may exchange little or no genetic material with related or adjacent species, while others may do so all the time. Species exist in nature as reproductive communities, not as separate creatures. The cross between a horse and a donkey, the mule, is certainly accepted in many cultures. But bacteria are mixing their genes all the time, so microbial diversity is extremely large. We can do that using artificial technologies as well. Both cell fusion, the joining of two cells together to make a cell containing parts or all of both cells, and genetic engineering techniques allow species barriers to be readily overcome. To challenge the integrity of species requires more than a single gene change. Mammals like mice contain 50,000 or more genes, and changing a small number of genes will not violate species integrity. Preservation of each species as a species is important, so we should not lose each species' identity. But the question of changing the genetic identity of individuals for human utility is harder to answer. The new strains should not be thought of as special man-made forms of life, considering the wide genetic variation naturally occurring. In fact, to think that we are masters of pretending to be God or arrogance. We can at best, maybe worst, generally only modify existing attributes by genetic engineering. The exception is to add additional genes for human benefit. For example, medical proteins can be made in the milk of animals, or vaccines can be put in bananas. New genes can be designed by human ingenuity for general medical reasons, or for living longer. But the ethical issue is what we do with them, not to modify something simply for human benefit. On the other hand, if we don't want to modify nature and want to stay as we are, we would stop building houses or even traditional agricultural breeding. For conservationists, the preservation of biodiversity in nature is their main concern. For conservation then of biodiversity, many argue we should maintain unmodified organisms and ecosystems separate from agricultural areas that may use genetically modified organisms and conserve crop diversity. At the same time, this will encourage protection of a diverse diversity of crops. Some people from all countries say that some developments of science and technology, such as genetic engineering, are interfering with nature because nature knows best. Protests have been seen in all countries, but in all activities we should not ignore the detrimental interventions that our lifestyle has upon nature. We have some good reasons to interfere with parts of nature. For example, we may try to cure many diseases that afflict humans or other living organisms, and we must eat. But there are other parts of nature we do not try and preserve, modify. The idea that genetic engineering is in some way interfering with nature lies more in the idea that genes are a foundation of life. The idea is that genes in some way are more sacred than other parts of an organism. Okay? However, DNA and entire genes can be made by purely synthetic procedures in a laboratory. A new catchphrase was gene ethics in 1989. Suzuki and Nedson suggested that the problems raised by genetic engineering cannot be dealt with ethically by existing ethical principles, by Western morals, and we must turn to Eastern religions. However, the principle of stewardship is not limited to one region of the world or another, and not to one religion for sure. It can be balanced with support for the creativity of technology to find more knowledge. While the use of genes may be seen as novel, we have actually a very long history of genetic modification. We've been using conventional techniques of plant and animal breeding for 7,000 years. So, what do you think? Is genetic engineering something which we should use? Does nature know best? Is gene ethics the appropriate term? As we pause to reflect, often as we read this text, I hope you reflect on the questions that come to your mind and how we should approach genetic technology. We have gained so much knowledge when implementing new varieties of organism, and we've seen whole civilizations depend on development of crops and animals. And you may be living with domestic animals that are bred from wolves, dogs. In another book, Hurd and Bayetz also used the term gene ethics in their book titles. Bayetz focused on human reproduction, starting with contraception and eugenics, and then discussed the idea of self-alteration. It also bases its conclusions on a reductionist view that genes determine what human beings are, and that we are currently in a crisis, have not been substantially altering ourselves through culture. Are we in this crisis or not? For some, there's a feeling But we should not explore all the mysteries of life, all the secrets. But we'll still be gone if we discover too much. When we apply our DNA technology to synthesize new DNA for genomes of new organisms that have not existed before, this is going too far. Well, I don't know. We do have practical requirements to feed, house and heal the people of the world. We have to clean the environment. These are major justifications for the pursuit of practical knowledge for any system of religion or philosophy that places a high value on life. It's a principle of loving others and loving good. At the same time, a negative science fiction image has been easily promoted and is appealing to human imagination. The fascination with creating new forms of life is coupled to a fear of how it might be taken. The Frankenstein factor was coined by Galen in 1976 as one of the names for wild scenarios imagined by some people, which represent the fear of the unknown or play on similar themes. And in 1993, the blockbuster movie Jurassic Park brought genetic engineering into the imagination of many, with the creation of dinosaurs from ancient DNA. These are very powerful to shaping public perceptions, no matter how realistic they are or not. And there's been many accusations that scientists are creating new life forms. However, our present technology is only capable of transferring 1 or 2 genes into a genetic background. That's the order of 100,000 genes. The term playing God is applied to situations where humans make life or death decisions without reference to God. This may be seen as pride or arrogance. It may not be the use of power and creativity that is wrong, but rather attributing power to our own resources, our own wisdom. And this reasoning is found in different cultures. I think what is wrong is not the act itself, but the attitudes that could be involved. However, useful applications of technology are positively advocated in some religions, such as in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which suggests that co-creativity with God is part of a good stewardship of the earth's resources, and actually can be acting in creative love. The expression playing God suggests that we should be cautious in the use of technology whose potential risks and side effects we do not fully understand. The idea to do no harm was also discussed above. It's the idea that while God may understand all, we do not. So we should not blindly manipulate things. We should do this only after caution, as this is basic. If we modify the genes, which are the basis of our life, perhaps we'll modify everything. Now, whether or not nature has itself rights, we certainly have duties to it, many of them. We should not manipulate nature solely to satisfy human desire. The theocentric approach challenges 2 common tendencies. Some religions tend to blur the distinction between God, human, and nature, and this leads to a glorification of nature. However, industrialized thought tends to divide humans from nature, seeing nature as something to exploit for human conflict. The same can be said of some interpretations of Darwinian theory. We must remember that we are creatures, part of nature, which is another interpretation of evolution. We are currently in a crisis of domination, not just in an ecological crisis, but a crisis of our whole life system. This is brought upon the entire globe by ourselves. The origin of this crisis is in human behavior and attitudes. And there is a tremendous power of our technologies to shape the world. As a reaction against this, some people attack what they see as a cause, science and technology, and its effect upon people's philosophy. However, the real cause is the age-old problem of human selfishness, which has become embedded in the short-term economic desires of many businesses and governments. The greatest public concern is over mixing of human and animal genes. This is generally more concern about the insertion of animal genes into humans than concern about the insertion of human genes into animals, unless you're an animal. However, some people object to the insertion of human growth hormone or hemoglobin genes in pigs. These animals may be used to make medically useful products. And this could be just an extension of the modern dairy industry, which tries to increase milk production in cows. There's also research to produce transgenic animals, which can be organ donors for humans. This is technically difficult, but ready for safety trials and application. Eating animals, or having inbred dog varieties, is considered acceptable, which suggests that it will be within the bounds of common morality to use animals for organ donors. One could argue that the medical need is a greater reason than a desire to eat meat, so this could be accepted rather than eating. However, one can also say that everyone has some limit to changing nature. And we do not know where that is, and it's up to each person to decide that limit. This is a picture of a fish market in the Philippines. As we shift to aquaculture for salmon, will people still be able to buy small fish for human consumption? The global exchange of goods is seen when we see a vegetable shop. This actually is a street vegetable vendor in Astana, Kazakhstan. When I was here, the vegetables from around the world were brought here and sold in each country. This actually was more like an informal economy, this street vendor. And they're selling quite a diverse variety of crops. Some of these crops are not traditionally available. Growing algae in ponds, such as this pond shown in Eilat in Egypt, will our future food production be supplemented by single-cell organisms that have high productivity in hot climates? Perhaps Dunaliella algae can be used to produce substances such as carotene, which have great health benefits for us. And so that is the image that we might see in more and more of the desert as we utilize the sun's energy. So in this lecture, we've addressed the love of nature. We see that there is some inherent love of nature, some biophilia. At the same time, we have an environment crisis. We have objection to modification of nature, and a case study was taken of genetic engineering. Many others could be taken, but this was one which has been very discussed, widely discussed in the 1980s, 90s, and currently. Whether it continues to be discussed is unclear. I'm now living in the United States, where most food is genetically modified, and it's very widely used. However, we have some supermarkets now which say their food is not genetically modified, marketing at a higher price to say that you can buy this if you think it's more natural, and some people do. So that's not the end of this chapter in the book, but that's the end of this lecture. We will deal with the next part of this chapter of Biophysics' Love of Life in a further lecture. I would like you, as you listen to this lecture, to write about your views of nature. Do we really have a biophilia? Do we have a love of nature? And if we do, how can we utilize that for environmental ethics education or for policies to protect nature? So that would be what I'd like listeners and to think about and write from this lecture. Thank you.